Lion in the Wind. Chapter 7. A bug landed on Tegani's nose and began to clean its wings as he tried his best to focus on the little insect. Persia saw this and laughed. "Hey, Dad, I think Tegani found a new friend," she said playfully. Bergen looked curiously at Persia and then over at Tegani. He soon spotted the little bug on Tegani's nose and smiled. The bug eventually flew away into a nearby stand of grass. But Tegani said nothing, instead merely observing its behavior with curiosity. Suddenly he felt a familiar presence fill his mind. "Tegani! The Dark One's agents come for you. Protect your family," shouted a familiar voice in his head. Tegani quickly pattern matched the voice and found it to be identical to the man he'd seen the night he became self-aware. "Mashwa," he said quietly to himself. Just then his eyes caught sight of a large group of Vandros racing across the facility towards him. They soon stopped in front of Tegani and cautiously eyed him. Tegani studied them with muted interest as he searched his expansive knowledge database in a vain attempt to identify them. But nothing he could find matched any of the creatures in front of him. "Who are you?" he asked. "Are you the proxy?" hissed one of them in a tortured, twisted voice. Bergen, who had initially been oblivious to their approach, cried out in surprise. This in turn startled Persia, who sat up suddenly and soon spotted the Vandros as well. But instead of being frightened, she merely studied them with curiosity. "I am not a proxy. I am a sentient, cybernetic life form who is currently undergoing testing by my father," said Tegani flatly. Just then the Grek landed next to the lead Vandros and pointed a wing at Tegani. "That's him. That's the proxy," it cried. The lead Vandros bared his teeth and growled angrily. Tegani cocked an eyebrow in interest. "Prepare yourself. They are about to attack," said the voice. "Are you here to hurt my family?" Tegani asked the Vandros. "We are here to destroy you and all those who oppose our master," cried the lead Vandros. The Grek squawked angrily at Tegani and then bounded into the air. It knew a fight was coming and wanted nothing to do with it. The lead Vandros glanced briefly at the Grek and then back at Tegani. He grinned with hungry glee. Tegani's eyes narrowed as he stood to his feet. It didn't take much to realize what came next. "Persia, take Dad to safety," he said. Suddenly the lead Vandros leapt at him, his teeth aimed strategically at the lion's throat. But this was no surprise to Tegani, who'd fully anticipated the move. He quickly turned his body and threw his shoulder hard into the creature's face, deflecting it away. "Tegani!" cried Persia. "Go! Get father out of here!" roared Tegani. The lead Vandros slowly picked himself up from the ground and cackled mockingly. "You will die, proxy, as will your family," he barked angrily. The Vandros then looked at two of the others and motioned towards the lion. Tegani bared his teeth and prepared himself for the coming attack. A moment later two of the creatures leapt at him. But, to their surprise, he'd also anticipated this move as well. Reaching out at the leaping Vandros, he grabbed both of them by their heads with his front paws and slammed them face first into the ground. Seeing an opportunity, the lead Vandros turned and leapt on Tegani's back. But as he bit down hard on the lion's neck, he found only an armored body shell below the lion's soft furry skin. Tegani quickly turned and threw the Vandros off his back like a leaf. The other 5 Vandros who remained considered entering the fight, but chose instead to stay back. It was already getting too crowded around the lion and the extra bodies wouldn't help. The 3 fighting against him would need all the room they could get if they were to have any hope of beating him. The first 3 Vandros pulled back slightly, reorganized their attack, and then leapt again. Persia watched in horror as Tegani fought bravely to fend off the attacks of the 3 Vandros. Realizing that it wasn't safe to stay there anymore, Bergen grabbed Persia by the collar and pulled hard. "Persia! We need to go, now," he shouted. "No! Tegani!" cried Persia as she tried to pull away from him. The 3 Vandros continued to strike again and again at Tegani as they pressed their attack. But they were repeatedly driven back. Realizing that they wouldn't win this fight the old-fashioned way, the lead Vandross turned to the other 5 who were waiting nearby and gave a sharp, commanding bark. Although he'd said no words, the order was clear enough. The 5 remaining Vandross turned their attention towards Tegani's family. Seeing that they had now become targets of the remaining Vandross, Bergen pulled harder on Persia's collar. "Persia! Come on! We need to run," cried Bergen. "Tegani!" cried Persia as she struggled to break free. Tegani turned and glared at her with a cold, icy gaze. It was at that moment that Persia understood. Despite being a machine, Tegani was willing to die for her. But if she insisted on staying, it would only hinder his efforts to protect her. She then turned and ran for the back door of the laboratory, nearly pulling Bergen off his feet as she did. But the 5 Vandross who now hunted them were not about to let them get away. They immediately gave pursuit. Seeing this, Tegani roared with anger, turned, and raced after them with all of his speed and strength. The lead Vandross and his 2 partners immediately gave chase. As he ran, Tegani analyzed the situation in front of him and felt a pang of anxiety flow through his body. Despite his incredible speed, he would not be able to stop all 5 of the Vandross in time. But if he didn't, his mother and father would both die. But, just as the Vandross reached Bergen, a shot rang out followed by the gut-wrenching sound of metal on bone that echoed through the air. A Vandross lurched in pain and then crumpled to the ground in a rolling, oily heap of black flesh. The other 4 Vandross, uncertain of what had just happened, stopped short and then looked in confusion at their comrade. A second shot rang out as the head of another Vandross snapped back hard, a misty cloud of crimson red erupting from between his eyes. The creature crumpled to the ground in a heap and lay motionless in a pool of its own blood. The other 3 looked around frantically as Tegani and the remaining 3 Vandross closed quickly on them from behind. Just then their eyes caught sight of 2 guards standing near a corner of the laboratory aiming rifles at them. One of the Vandross turned to its leader, cried out in warning and then fell silent as a bullet ripped through its head. It crumpled to the ground and lay still. Not wanting to risk fate any further, the remaining 2 Vandross turned and bolted towards Tegani. But the lion would not let them pass without a fight. He leapt at the first one, grabbed its neck with his paws and slammed it hard into the ground. The blow crushed the creature's throat and snapped its neck, killing it instantly. Then, using his remaining momentum, Tegani swung his body around and kicked the other Vandross in the face so hard that it snapped the creature's neck while simultaneously crushing part of its skull. It too collapsed to the ground and lay still. The remaining 3 Vandross, realizing that it was now an all-or-nothing fight to the finish, rallied their courage and turned on Tegani. But as they did, a pair of bullets whizzed past their heads. Tegani, seeing an advantage to the gunfire, turned and raced towards the guards, drawing the remaining Vandross after him. "What are you doing?" came a voice in his head. The voice sounded as if it already knew the answer, but wanted to make sure that Tegani did as well. However, Tegani said nothing as he continued to charge towards the guards, Vandross in tow. Seeing this, one of the guards took aim at him and fired. But to his complete surprise, the bullet bounced harmlessly off the lion's head. "What in the blazes?" he said. "Don't shoot at me." "Shoot at the wolves," cried Tegani. "It talked," cried the second guard. "Then it's gotta be a robot." "Concentrate your fire on those wolves," shouted the first guard. A moment later they were joined by 3 more guards. Seeing that any hope of victory had suddenly vaporized, the 3 Vandross spun on their heels and bolted for the safety of the prairie. But they only made it a few steps before a lethal hail of bullets cut them down. A moment later, even more guards joined them, responding to reports of gunfire on the south side of the facility. By the time they arrived, there was nothing left to see but an oily, robotic lion and 8 dead Vandross. Seeing that the battle was over, Tegani turned to the nearby guards, and said, "If you will excuse me, I must rejoin my family." "Yeah, go ahead." "We got this," replied the guard. Tegani nodded in thanks, and then made his way back to the laboratory. As he stepped inside, Persia nearly tackled him to the floor, grateful to see that he was all right. Tears rolled down her face as she hugged him tightly. "Oh, I'm so glad you're okay, she cried. I am undamaged, said Tegani. Are they dead? Asked Bergen. Tegani nodded. Their life functions have fully ceased, and will not be restored, he replied. Persia sighed with relief and then grimaced with disgust as a strong, pungent odor assaulted her nose. Bergen also noticed the odor and covered his face with a rag. What is that smell? Cried Persia. I appear to have picked up some of the pungent residue that clung to the coats of those creatures, said Tegani. Ugh, you're going to need a bath, said Persia. She then covered her nose with her paw and soon realized that the odor wasn't going away. In fact, it gotten stronger. She lowered her paw and smelled herself. It nearly made her gag. I got it on me too. Great, now I'm going to have to take a regular bath because I'm certainly not going to lick this stuff off. Well, let's go over and get you both cleaned up, said Bergen. Persia and Tegani followed Bergen over to a washing stall where he lathered up Persia, scrubbed her down and rinsed her off. Seeing that she was now clean again, she sniffed at her fur, and then grimaced. Bergen laughed. Not clean enough? Persia shook her head. He lathered her up again, scrubbed even harder, and then rinsed her off a second time. She sniffed herself again and nodded in approval. Bergen then motioned to Tegani, who obeyed and stepped into the shower. Bergen lathered him up, scrubbed him down and then had Persia inspect the lion. To his surprise, Tegani passed inspection on the first try. I have been cleaned. May I step out now? Asked Tegani. Not just yet, young man. Open wide, he said. Tegani gave the doctor a puzzled look. Bergen smiled. Your mouth. Open it wide. Tegani obliged and the doctor took a brush and some soap and washed Tegani's mouth and teeth clean of the black substance that covered them. He then briefly inspected the rest of the lion and eventually nodded in approval. Now that looks a lot better. However, I won't be able to do this for you all the time. So you'll need to learn how to do this on your own at some point. What would that be? Asked Tegani. The doctor smiled. Cleaning yourself. Tegani cocked his head slightly. If you will teach me an appropriate method to do so, I will willingly partake in such actions in the future. The doctor nodded. I'll do that. But we'll worry about that later. We've had enough excitement for one day, so I'm going home. Tegani turned his head and looked in the direction of Persia. Why was Mother's face wet? Well, wait, did you just say Mother? Said Bergen curiously. Tegani nodded. Bergen chuckled. You actually consider Persia your mother? He asked in surprise. Again Tegani nodded. It's a simple logical conclusion. You are my creator and you are male, therefore you are my father. She is female and your companion, therefore she is my mother. Two beings, a mother and a father, are required in order to bring life to anything. Bergen grinned. While he didn't completely understand how Tegani had come to that conclusion, he liked the idea. If nothing else, it added legitimacy to his sentience. So you're his mom now, Persia? He asked. Persia nodded. Yeah, I am. He asked me if he could call me that a couple of days ago and I said yes. I think it's kind of cool being the mother of a big metal brute like him, she said. She then batted at Tegani playfully. Bergen chuckled. Why was Mother's face wet? Asked Tegani, repeating his original question. That's because I took a shower, silly. Tegani looked at her incredulously. I was not referring to that. I was speaking in reference to the fluid that so readily flowed from your eyes earlier, before your bath. I believe you call it crying. Persia seemed offended by the suggestion, and yet nearly ready to burst into tears. I was not crying, she protested, her voice cracking slightly. But try as she might, a tear escaped from her eye and streamed down her face. Tegani gently reached over, scooped up the tear and then showed it to her. Then what is this? He asked. Persia blushed slightly beneath her fur. Well, I was worried about you, she said as she shyly pawed the ground. Worry makes you cry, asked Tegani curiously. Many things make us cry, Tegani. Worry, fear, happiness and most of all sadness. It's a part of who we are, said Bergen. Tegani pondered this for a moment. Then certain emotions can cause the excessive function of the tear ducts resulting in the overflow of tear fluid I witnessed, he asked. They can. Emotions have a way of affecting our bodies in many strange and unique ways, tears being one of them. Mod. My data suggests that tears are a biological reaction to a need for nourishment and moisture in the eyes. But the level of excretion that would cause a running of tear fluid from the eyes in excesses such as is being displayed in Mom's current behavior does not coincide with the data I have on record. Logically, such an activity is not one that the body should willingly undertake. Persia quickly wiped away her tears, but more soon replaced them. Bergen shook his head. Not everything can be answered through the application of logic, Tegani. Some things require emotions to be properly understood, he said. Tegani tilted his head, and said, emotions are not logical. Bergen shrugged. They're not meant to be. But they are a necessary component of life. Tegani studied Bergen curiously as he contemplated this. How would I acquire these emotions? I am most interested in having them, he asked. Bergen thought about this question for several moments, and then said, I'm afraid that's something I can't help you with. For Yigsen, emotions come naturally. Therefore, I don't know of any easy way to teach them to someone like yourself. So why don't you go plug yourself into the mainframe tonight and do a little research on this? Then, if you still have questions in the morning, feel free to ask either of us and we'll try to answer as best we can. Tegani nodded. I will do that. A thin, somewhat homely-looking middle-aged woman knocked on the door of the General Secretary's office and then peeked cautiously inside. Sorry to bother you, sir, but Senator Jocelyn is here to see you. He says it's urgent. The General Secretary looked up from his desk and said, send him in. The secretary quickly disappeared and a gray-haired man appeared in her place a moment later, an expression of dire concern on his face. Senator Jocelyn, what brings you here today? Asked the General Secretary. I'm sorry to bother you on such a prestigious day. No, it's nothing at all. This really isn't all that big of a holiday. I just have to be seen, shake a few hands, and drink some wine with a few of my bigger constituents. You know, the usual political stuff, said the General Secretary with a sarcastic grin. Jocelyn smirked. Your humor is just as flat as it's always been, he quipped. The General Secretary chuckled. I aim to please. So, what can I do for you today? My secretary says it's urgent. It is, and it involves the peace and security of our country. The General Secretary folded his hands in interest. I'm always concerned about that. What news could be so grave that it would stir up an ever-jolly senator like yourself? Jocelyn frowned. We are about to be invaded. The General Secretary furrowed his brow in interest. Invaded? Who would stoop to such a preposterous low? The senator pulled a folder from his briefcase and slid it across the desk. The gourd wood. The General Secretary opened the folder and studied the papers inside. Interesting information. But I am curious as to why you know about this, and my own military does not, he said. Jocelyn shook his head. That's just it. They do know about this. The General Secretary stared curiously at Jocelyn. If they know about it, why haven't they told me? He asked. There are members within our military who wish to hide this fact. They do not believe that anyone would attack us, and thus have worked to hide this fact from others who might force them to act upon such information. The General Secretary studied the papers again. And why do you have this information? He asked suspiciously. Because there are members within your military who still love this country, and wish to see it protected at all costs. But until now they have been hindered from doing so by their superiors. That is why they have come to me in hopes that I might be able to do what they could not. The General Secretary looked at the pages again, stopping at one particular paragraph towards the middle of the second page. We have less than a year left to prepare, he said in surprise. Jocelyn nodded. We do. But there is good news mingled in with all of that bad news. A silent party within the military has slowly been preparing our forces for the coming war. They have nearly completed all their preparations to ensure that we are ready when the Gorg finally attack. And who are these people? They're listed in that folder. However, be careful who you share their names with. These men have risked a lot exposing themselves like this, and fear reprisal if their identities become known. They are just honest soldiers trying to do their job and protect this country despite wishes to the contrary by their superiors. The General Secretary's face began to grow red with anger. Is that so? Well then, if you will excuse me, Senator, I need to have a long discussion with my cabinet about this. The senator stood and slid another file folder across the desk to the General Secretary. Thank you, sir. Now, before I go, I think you should also read this. I know you've got more important things to deal with right now, but this is important enough for you to look into as well. Upon learning of our situation, I took it upon myself to do a little research and discovered some possible new weapon systems that may help us better defend ourselves in the upcoming war. Jocelyn then excused himself from the room. The General Secretary took the folder, opened it, and read the contents. He then turned to his desk phone and pressed the intercom. Get the Secretary of Defense and my generals in here right now, he said firmly. Yes, sir, replied the Secretary. A half hour later 3 men walked into the General Secretary's office to find him sitting behind his desk with his hands folded, and his eyes ablaze with anger. You called us, sir, said the Secretary of Defense. The General Secretary pushed a plain brown folder across his desk and asked, Would you gentlemen mind explaining this? Tegani sat alone on a hillside behind the laboratory and studied the stars overhead as they glistened brightly through a dark, moonless sky. He slowly went through everything he'd learned over the previous days and tried to make sense of it all. But, despite his best efforts, little of it made sense to him. He watched curiously as a meteorite streaked across the sky in a brilliant flash of light, and then disappeared. Just then Tegani sensed something. It felt warm and comforting in a way he'd only encountered twice before. It hadn't been something he'd detected through the normal application of his 5 senses. Instead, it was something he felt deep inside. It didn't make sense, and yet it was as real as the smell of the prairie that filled the air around him. He raised an eyebrow in curiosity. Was it a system malfunction? If it was, he could quickly run a diagnostic, find the source of the problem, and then fix it. But he didn't think it was anything like that. Malfunctions didn't feel this way. He thought about this for a moment longer and then came up with 2 possible ideas of what the feeling might be. He decided to test the first and see if that was it. If it wasn't, then he knew what he needed to do. How long do you plan to sit there like that? He asked, probing to see if his first guess was correct. And it was. A light suddenly appeared next to him, and bathed the area in a soft white glow. Tegani then turned and looked curiously at a man who now sat next to him clothed in glowing white robes. Hello, Tegani, said the man kindly. You are Mashwa. Am I correct? Asked Tegani. The man looked at him, and smiled. I am. Tegani looked up at the stars and pondered this. You were there when I first became aware of myself. Mashwa smiled. I was. You also came into my mind, and talked to me when those creatures attacked me the other day. My research tells me that you existed before records were first kept, and that you have been seen throughout history during various periods of crisis. You also have the ability to appear and disappear at will, traveling great distances in the blink of an eye with the aid of no machine or transportation device that we understand to be possible, and you are neither bound by time nor space. It is also reported that you have the ability to know the hearts and minds of men, even though they speak no words to you. He then looked at Mashwa, and said, You are not logical. Mashwa laughed. Tegani, not everything in this world can be explained with logic. Your father has told you that many times, he said kindly. Tegani nodded. That would be a logical statement. No pun intended, of course. Mashwa chuckled. But I suspect that you are not here to show me how to understand this illogical world in which I live, continued Tegani. Mashwa looked at the young lion with careful concern. No, I am here to warn you that a war is coming. A great enemy has arisen that threatens my people with extinction. Tegani turned his attention back to the stars as though contemplating this new revelation. After several moments he looked back at Mashwa. What is my place in this great struggle? He asked. You will be required to risk much to protect them from harm. What that will be, though, has yet to be revealed. Tegani seemed puzzled by this. It is said that you know and understand all, and yet you do not know what is to come? I do indeed know all that is to come. However, it has not yet been given to you to know all that is to transpire before you. Tegani cocked his head slightly. Why is this so? Because you are not ready. In time you will be. But for now it is best that you don't know the sum total of all you must face. It is for your good that you remain uninformed. Tegani thought about this for a bit, and then said, I understand. He then turned his eyes to the stars again. Mashwa studied his eyes for several moments, and then smiled slightly. Something troubles your mind. What is it? He asked. The creatures I fought the other day were in search of one who was to be a proxy. Am I the one they spoke of? And if so, what am I a proxy for? Have you heard of one called Nagago? Tegani furrowed his brow. The Dark Lord of Varric, ruler of the Firelands, and master of all evil things? Yes, I am well aware of him. He is an enemy of all that is good. His existence is listed as being merely legend. However, since you two were once considered legend, I suspect that he is real as well. Mashwa nodded. He is also your greatest enemy. Tegani studied Mashwa curiously. But why? What have I done to deserve such hostility towards me? You have done nothing of yourself. Nagago hates anything and everything associated with my father and I. He wants nothing more than to destroy us, and everything we have created. Then why this battle by proxy? Such a tactic would indicate that he does not have the strength by which to defeat you in single combat. Mashwa shook his head. He does not. Tegani cocked an eyebrow slightly. Then why not simply defeat him once and for all, and bring an end to his reign of terror? Mashwa smiled again. That is something you will learn the answer to in time. But for now you have enough on your mind. I will not burden you with anything more than you are capable of handling. But what about my place as your proxy? What am I required to do? Live, and protect my people the best you can. That is all that I ask of you. Tegani looked at him curiously. Are they not my people as well? Mashwa smiled. Not yet. But in time they will be. The young lion contemplated this for several moments. But I am only one person. How am I able to do such a monumental task? He said. Mashwa gently took Tegani's face in his hands. You do not need to carry the entire weight of the world on your shoulders, only that small bit which I have put before you. Now go, and fulfill your destiny. And with that, he was gone. Tegani thought about this for several moments, and then looked up at the stars again. I still do not understand my place. However, I will trust you and go forward as you have requested, he said.